The train screeched to a halt at the dusty little station, its whistle echoing across the wide plains. Lydia gripped the worn handle of her small valise, her heart pounding with anticipation. Months of letters had led to this day. She had left everything familiar behind, her childhood home, her friends, and the only life she'd known, on the promise of a fresh start in the West as a mail-order bride. She stepped onto the platform, her skirts brushing against her shoes, and looked around eagerly. The station was humble, a wooden structure, weathered by sun and wind, with a single bench outside and a handful of travelers disembarking. Farmers, ranch hands, and families reunited with hugs and laughter. Lydia's eyes scanned the crowd for the man who was supposed to be hers. Thomas Green, the rancher who had written with such warmth and conviction that she had dared to believe a stranger could become a husband, even a partner in life. At first, she smiled, certain he must simply be caught in the bustle. She smoothed her hair, checked the fit of her bonnet, and clutched the letter he'd sent confirming he would meet her. Time stretched, and people began to thin from the platform, going about their business. The sun dipped a little lower, shadows lengthening across the cracked wooden planks beneath her boots. By the time the station master glanced at her for the third time with a mixture of pity and suspicion, Lydia's smile had faltered. A young boy pulling a cart slowed near her, whispering something to his companion before they both giggled. Lydia turned her face away, cheeks burning. Hours passed. The few travelers who had arrived on the same train were gone, their laughter replaced by the quiet hum of cicadas. The heat of the day pressed down heavily, and her throat felt tight, but she swallowed hard, unwilling to cry in front of strangers. Finally, an older woman approached, her shawl draped loosely over her shoulders. "Are you waiting on someone, dear?" she asked kindly. "Yes," Lydia said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "My fiancé, Thomas Green. He promised he'd meet me here." The woman's expression faltered, and her eyes darted away. "Ah," she murmured, pressing her lips together before patting Lydia's hand briefly. "I hope he comes." With that, she moved on quickly, as if eager to escape the weight of the conversation. Lydia's heart dropped. She noticed then how some townsfolk had started giving her lingering glances, curious, sympathetic, even judgmental. Whispers carried on the warm air, though she couldn't catch the words. She shifted uncomfortably, clutching her valise tighter. Finally, the station master approached, removing his hat. "Miss," he said gently, "if you're waiting on Thomas Green, I don't reckon he's coming. Word is he lit out last week. Rode off with a saloon girl. Folks have been talking about it." The words struck like a physical blow. Lydia's knees wobbled, and she sank onto the bench, the wood creaking under her. Her vision blurred as hot tears pressed against her eyes, though she blinked furiously to keep them from falling. She could not, would not, let these strangers see her humiliated. She sat there, silent and rigid, as the truth sank in. She had been abandoned, left to make a fool of herself, standing alone at a station in a town where everyone now knew her business. The promise of a new life had crumbled into dust before her very eyes. Lydia's mind raced. She had no money for another ticket, nowhere to go, and no kin nearby. She had risked everything for this chance, sold her few possessions to pay for the journey. The thought of returning home empty-handed, shamed and pitied, was unbearable. Yet here she was, stranded. The sound of laughter carried from across the platform, sharp as a knife. A pair of young women whispered and pointed, their smiles mocking. Lydia looked away, pressing her handkerchief tightly to her lips. For the first time since she stepped off the train, she allowed herself to feel the ache of despair settle deep in her chest. The sun began to sink lower, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson. Shadows lengthened, and the platform grew quieter. Lydia felt smaller, more invisible, even as the weight of curious stares lingered. She whispered a prayer under her breath, asking for strength, though her voice trembled with hopelessness. She had come seeking a husband, a home, and a future. Instead, she sat abandoned, her heart breaking in the place where new beginnings were supposed to arrive. What Lydia didn't know, as she sat with tears threatening to spill, was that fate had not entirely turned against her. Her path, though not the one she imagined, was about to cross with two souls who would change her life forever. The longer Lydia remained at the station, the heavier the silence became. Though no one openly spoke to her, she could feel the weight of the townsfolk's eyes upon her, each glance like a thorn in her already fragile heart. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, baking the platform planks beneath her shoes until they smelled of dry resin and dust. Her small valise sat at her feet like a mocking reminder of her folly. Everything she owned, everything she thought, she would need for a fresh start, packed neatly in preparation for a husband who had never intended to greet her. She clenched her hands in her lap until her knuckles turned white, trying to still the tremble that threatened to give her shame away. Lydia had always been proud of her composure. Even in her hardest years back east, when she had struggled to find work after her parents' passing, she had held her chin high. But here, now, her pride felt like a brittle shell, one crack away from shattering entirely. She could not stand. The whispers she half heard. That must be the poor thing left by Thomas Green. Imagine traveling all that way just to be tossed aside. What kind of woman does such a thing? Desperate, I suppose? Their words, though faint, sliced through her. She stared hard at the ground, hoping her stiff posture might shield her from their pity. As the last of the travelers dispersed, the platform grew still. The station master busied himself with paperwork inside his office, the sound of his pen scratching faintly through the open door. A few wagons rattled past on the dirt road beyond, their wheels crunching against gravel, carrying families to supper tables Lydia would never see. Her stomach twisted, but she ignored the hunger. She had packed only a small bundle of food for the train ride, bread, cheese, and a few apples, all gone now. She had counted on her new husband to provide for her after this day. That expectation seemed laughable now, a cruel trick she had played on herself. The humiliation dug deeper the longer she sat. She pictured herself walking into the town proper, looking for work, perhaps a boarding house. But even as she imagined it, she knew the truth. No one would hire her quickly. A woman alone with no references here and no family to vouch for her would always be suspect. Some might offer her charity, but charity was a word that burned her tongue. She pressed her hands against her skirt, smoothing out creases that didn't matter, trying to think, to plan. But all she felt was the gnawing ache of despair creeping higher in her chest. A boy selling newspapers approached, his voice loud and eager. "Paper, ma'am? Today's headlines?" He looked no older than 12, his freckled face grinning. But when Lydia shook her head and he caught the strain in her eyes, his smile faltered. He muttered a quiet, "Sorry, miss," and hurried away. Even children could see her shame. The sound of her name, overheard in hushed tones behind her, made her stiffen. She turned just enough to catch a group of townsfolk whispering. They didn't bother to lower their voices. She was supposed to marry Green, wasn't she? Yes, but he's gone now. Didn't even leave a note. Left her stranded. Poor soul. Poor soul. The words settled over her like a burial shroud. The temptation to cry was overwhelming. She had told herself she would be strong, that she would face whatever came with dignity. But dignity seemed like a luxury when one's heart had been crushed in public view. She pressed her handkerchief against her mouth, her breath trembling, her body rigid as she fought the tears threatening to fall. She imagined writing to her friend back home, confessing what had happened. The humiliation of putting pen to paper and admitting she had been jilted was unbearable. What would they think? Of her? Foolish Lydia, so desperate to escape her lonely life that she gambled everything on a stranger's promise. Her thoughts spiraled into darker places. If she had nowhere to go, no money, and no husband, then what future could she possibly claim? The West had promised her freedom and belonging, but all it had given her was the hollow echo of abandonment. The sun dipped lower, streaking the horizon with orange and violet. The platform grew nearly deserted. Lydia sat hunched on the bench, her back aching, her spirit crumbling. She whispered a prayer, her lips barely moving. "Please, Lord, don't let this be the end of me." Yet as she sat there, weary and broken, she did not see the small figure watching her from a distance. Bright eyes, curious and full of sympathy, followed her from behind the wooden rail of the platform. Little feet shuffled forward hesitantly, as though sensing Lydia's grief. The platform had grown quiet, the last of the day's bustle fading into evening stillness. Lydia sat slumped forward, her hands folded tightly around the handle of her valise, her eyes fixed on the ground. She felt as though she had been carved, out of stone, unmoving, unfeeling, yet filled with a heavy ache that threatened to break her apart if she dared breathe too deeply. Her thoughts circled endlessly. What would she do? Where would she go? How would she survive? She was alone, humiliated, and utterly without a plan. And then, a tiny hand slipped into hers. The unexpected warmth startled her. Lydia jerked slightly and looked down. Standing beside her was a little girl no older than 6. Her hair was a tangle of sun-bleached curls, her cheeks smudged with dust, and her eyes, wide, curious, and unflinchingly earnest, were fixed on Lydia's tear-streaked face. For a moment, Lydia was too stunned to speak. Children were usually shy around strangers, especially ones sitting alone at train stations. But this child gazed up at her with the certainty of one who had found exactly what she had been looking for. "Don't cry," the little girl said softly, squeezing Lydia's hand. Her voice carried the sweetness of innocence, and yet there was something in her tone that sounded far older, as though she carried a wisdom beyond her years. Lydia blinked, swallowing hard. I'm not crying," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her. The child tilted her head, unconvinced. "Papa says it's all right to cry when your heart hurts. But he doesn't cry anymore. He just works and works and works." Her brow furrowed in the most serious expression Lydia had ever seen on such a small face. "I think he's lonely." "You look lonely, too." Before Lydia could find an answer, the girl tugged on her hand, gentle but insistent. "Come home to Papa," she said with surprising firmness, as though she were giving an order. "He needs you." The words fell like a strange kind of miracle. Lydia froze, her lips parting in disbelief. Surely she had misheard. Surely the child did not mean what it sounded like. I don't even know your papa," Lydia managed, her voice trembling between amusement and confusion. The little girl smiled, a bright, unwavering beam that seemed to slice through Lydia's despair. "That's all right. I'll introduce you." Lydia's breath caught in her throat. She glanced around the platform, half expecting some frantic mother to appear, scolding the child for talking to strangers. But there was no one, just the station master locking up his office and a pair of horses hitched to a wagon down the road. "Sweetheart," Lydia said carefully, "you shouldn't be talking to someone you don't know. Where is your mama?" The girl's smile dimmed for the first time. Her eyes dropped to her scuffed shoes. "Mama went to heaven last winter. Papa says she's watching over us. But I don't think Papa knows how to smile anymore." Lydia's heart squeezed painfully. She recognized the hollow grief in the child's words. the kind of ache that only loss could bring. Without thinking, she reached out and brushed a curl. From the girl's face, her maternal instincts stirred by the fragility of the little one before her. "I'm sorry," Lydia whispered. "That must be very hard." The girl nodded solemnly. "It is. But if Papa had someone nice, someone like you, maybe he wouldn't be so sad. You can come with me. I'll show you the way." For the first time since stepping off the train, Lydia felt something shift inside her, a tiny flicker of warmth piercing through her despair. She should have laughed at the absurdity. She should have declined politely and sent the child back to her father. But instead, she found herself hesitating. The child's hand in hers was firm, reassuring as if it belonged there. Lydia realized how long it had been since someone had held her hand without judgment or pity. "I don't even know your name," Lydia murmured, stalling. "Emily," the girl replied quickly, her eyes brightening again. "What's yours?" "Lydia." Emily repeated it softly, as though trying it out, and then grinned. "Lydia, I like that. Papa will like it too." Before Lydia could protest further, Emily tugged again, pulling her toward the dirt road. Lydia hesitated, glancing back at her lone valise sitting on the bench. She thought of the long, empty night ahead if she stayed here, alone, ridiculed, hopeless. Then she looked down at the small hand clutching hers, offering not just comfort but purpose. The dirt road stretched out beyond the station, winding past weathered buildings and fading into the open plains where the horizon glowed with the last light of evening. Lydia walked beside Emily, her valise bumping against her leg, the little girl's hand still firmly in her own. Each step felt both strange and oddly natural, as though she were being pulled into a story she hadn't agreed to join but couldn't quite resist. "Are you sure your papa won't mind us just showing up like this?" Lydia asked, glancing down at the child. She tried to sound casual, though her heart beat with uncertainty. Emily looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes. "He won't mind. He needs you. He just doesn't know it yet." The boldness of the words startled Lydia. Children, she thought, had a way of seeing things adults could not or dared not. Emily's tone carried such confidence that Lydia almost believed it herself. They passed the last building of town, a small mercantile with its shutters drawn for the night, and stepped into the open expanse of the prairie. The scent of sagebrush hung in the cooling air, mingling with the faint aroma of livestock drifting from somewhere ahead. Lydia tried to focus on these details, anything to keep her thoughts from unraveling. Who was this child's father? What sort of man had raised a girl so bold and earnest? Was he kind or hardened by loss? Would he be angry to find a strange woman brought to his doorstep by his daughter? Lydia's chest tightened at the thought. She already knew too well the sting of rejection. Emily, however, seemed unconcerned. She chattered as they walked, telling Lydia about her pony named Clover, about the big oak tree behind their house where she liked to sit and pretend it was a castle, and about how her papa worked harder than anyone she knew. "He fixes fences, rides the range, chops wood, and still tucks me in every night," Emily said proudly. "But he never laughs anymore, not like before Mama got sick." The words tugged at Lydia's heart. She glanced down at the girl, catching the flicker of sadness in her small face, and felt a surge of tenderness she hadn't expected. Perhaps it was the way Emily clung to her hand as if it were an anchor, or perhaps it was the raw honesty of a child speaking of loss. Either way, Lydia found herself wanting to protect her, to ease that sorrow if she could. By the time they reached the ranch, the sky had shifted to indigo, the first stars pricking through the fading light. A modest house stood at the center of the property, its wooden siding weathered but sturdy. A lantern flickered in the front window, casting a warm glow over the porch. Beyond it stretched fields and corrals, the silhouettes of horses and cattle, just visible against the fading light. Emily let go of Lydia's hand only long enough to dash up the steps. She flung the door open without hesitation and called into the house, her voice high and eager. "Papa! Papa! I brought someone home!" Lydia froze at the bottom of the steps, clutching her valise. Her heart hammered as heavy footsteps sounded from inside. The door creaked wider and a tall man stepped into view. He was rugged, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows and his hair tousled from work. His face bore the marks of sun and toil, his jaw set in a way that spoke of a man accustomed to carrying burdens. But it was his eyes, steady, cautious, and filled with a flicker of surprise that caught Lydia's breath. Emily rushed to his side, tugging at his hand. "Papa, this is Lydia. She was sad at the station, and I thought maybe she could help us. She's nice, I can tell." The rancher's gaze shifted to Lydia, guarded and uncertain. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Lydia swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, fumbling for words. I was left at the station," she managed finally, her voice soft with shame. "The man I was to marry? He didn't come. Your daughter. She was kind enough to speak to me." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the chirping of crickets outside. The rancher studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. At last, he looked down at Emily, who was staring up at him with hopeful eyes. "Emily," he said gently, "you can't just bring strangers home." "But she's not a stranger anymore," Emily insisted. "She's Lydia, and she needs us." The words struck Lydia unexpectedly deep. She blinked back sudden tears, embarrassed by how much she longed for them to be true. The rancher sighed, running a hand through his hair. His gaze softened just enough to betray the war inside him. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said quietly. "You can tell me the rest inside." With trembling hands, Lydia lifted her valise and stepped across the threshold. What she didn't know was that this house, built on hard work, grief, and resilience, would soon become the place where her broken heart found the possibility of healing. The warmth of the lantern light enveloped Lydia as she stepped into the ranch house. The interior was modest but tidy, every surface speaking of a man's practicality rather than a woman's gentle touch. A large wooden table dominated the room, scarred with years of use. Coats hung neatly by the door, and the faint scent of leather and wood smoke lingered in the air. Emily scampered inside, tugging Lydia along until they stood in the middle of the room. The rancher, Jack, she would soon learn, closed the door, firmly behind them. The sound echoed like finality, and Lydia's heart beat faster, wondering if she had made a mistake in coming here. Jack's eyes, the color of storm clouds, studied her with careful caution. His broad frame filled the space, and his roughened hands bore the calluses of long labor. He didn't move closer but leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Well," he said at last, his voice low and steady, "it seems my daughter has a mind of her own." Emily beamed. "I told you, Papa, she's nice. She was all alone at the station and she looked so sad. We couldn't just leave her there." Lydia's cheeks burned. She wanted to sink into the floor, but instead she straightened her shoulders, clinging to what dignity she had left. "I'm sorry for the intrusion," she said softly. "I didn't mean to impose. Emily was kind to me when I needed kindness. I can leave if you prefer." Jack's gaze lingered on her, unblinking. There was no cruelty in his expression, but there was no easy welcome either. He seemed to weigh her words carefully, as if assessing her character by the very way she stood before him. "You've had a rough day," he said finally. "Sit a spell. We'll talk." Grateful yet nervous, Lydia lowered herself onto a chair at the table. Emily climbed onto the seat beside her, swinging her little legs. Jack poured a glass of water from a pitcher and set it in front of Lydia. His movements were efficient, unceremonious, but she recognized the gesture for what it was. Hospitality, however cautious. "Thank you," Lydia murmured, sipping gratefully. The cool water eased her parched throat. For a moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the creak of Emily's chair as she fidgeted. Jack's steady gaze remained fixed on Lydia, waiting. At last, she found the courage to explain. "I came here, expecting to be met by a man named Thomas Green. He and I had been corresponding for several months. He promised marriage, a home, a new life. But when I arrived at the station, he wasn't there. I later learned he had left with someone else." Her voice faltered, shame pressing down on her. "So, you see, I am stranded. I have nowhere to go." Emily's small hand patted Lydia's arm as if to comfort her. "See, Papa? She needs us." Jack's jaw tightened, but his expression did not soften. "That's a hard thing," he said simply. His words carried the weight of someone who knew disappointment, though he offered no details. Lydia nodded, lowering her gaze. She had expected sympathy to sting, but his lack of judgment steadied her. She wasn't pitied, she was merely understood. "I don't ask for charity," she added quickly. "If you'll allow me to stay the night, I'll find a way to earn my keep. I can cook, sew, clean. Whatever is needed." Jack rubbed a hand along his jaw, the rasp of stubble audible in the quiet. "I don't make a habit of taking in strangers. Folks around here like to talk, and talk has a way of turning into trouble." The words cut, but Lydia could not blame him. He had his daughter to protect. Yet before she could reply, Emily spoke up with fierce conviction. "She's not a stranger. She's Lydia. And Mama always said to help people when they're hurting." Jack looked down at his daughter, something soft flickering across his stern features. He exhaled slowly, then turned his gaze back to Lydia. "You can stay tonight," he said at last. "We'll see about tomorrow after that." Relief washed over Lydia so quickly she nearly wept. She clasped her hands in her lap to steady them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her effort to keep it firm. Jack gave a small nod, then pushed away from the doorframe. "Emily, fetch an extra blanket for our guest. She'll take the spare room." Emily bounced off her chair with delight, scampering down the hallway. The sound of her laughter filled the house, lightening the heavy air. Left alone with Jack, Lydia felt the tension return. He stood across from her, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes still searched hers as though trying to decide whether she was a blessing or a burden. "I'll not promise more than a roof over your head for the night," he said firmly. "But you'll find I don't turn away those in need, leastways, not when my little girl has already decided otherwise." A faint smile tugged at Lydia's lips, despite her nerves. "Your daughter has a strong will." Jack's gaze softened slightly. "That she does." Their eyes held for a moment longer, something unspoken passing between them, an understanding that this meeting, unexpected as it was, might be the beginning of something neither had imagined. The spare room was little more than a small square, off the main hallway, but to Lydia it felt like a sanctuary. Its single bed was neatly made with a patchwork quilt, the wood floor swept clean, and a pitcher of water with a basin stood ready on the small dresser. She placed her valise gently at the foot of the bed and exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. She hadn't expected kindness tonight, not after the humiliation at the station. Yet here she was, beneath a stranger's roof, thanks to the stubborn insistence of a little girl with curls and wide eyes. "Papa fixed this room for when Aunt May visits," Emily explained proudly, bouncing onto the bed. "But you can use it tonight. Maybe longer." "Emily," Jack's voice carried from the doorway, calm but edged with caution. He leaned one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed. "We don't make promises we can't keep." Emily's face fell, but she nodded, obedient, though disappointed. Lydia caught the child's quick glance at her, as if to say, "Don't mind him. He'll come around." Jack turned his steady gaze to Lydia. "Like I said, you're welcome for the night. We'll see about tomorrow when it comes." Lydia dipped her head in gratitude. "That's more than I could have hoped for. Thank you, Mr. Carter," he supplied. "Jack Carter." "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Jack will do." His tone was curt but not unkind. With a small nod, he stepped away, leaving Lydia and Emily in the room. Supper was simple: roasted potatoes, beans, and bread warmed on the stove. Lydia sat at the table with Emily while Jack ladled food onto plates. The meal might have been plain, but after a day of stale bread and fear gnawing at her stomach, it tasted like a feast. Still, she was keenly aware of Jack's eyes flicking toward her now and then, measuring, assessing. He said little, though Emily filled the silence with cheerful chatter. She told stories about her pony, about the time she had helped her papa mend a fence, about how she wished she could learn to bake pies, but never had anyone to teach her. Lydia smiled, offering small comments, but mostly she listened. She noticed how Jack's expression softened, if only slightly, when Emily laughed. Beneath his guarded exterior was a man who clearly adored his daughter, though grief had carved lines of weariness into his face. After the meal, Lydia insisted on helping wash the dishes. Jack started to protest, but she shook her head firmly. "I'll not sit idle while you both work," she said. "Let me at least do this much." Emily giggled, splashing a bit of water as she handed her father a dripping plate to dry. Lydia rolled up her sleeves, plunging her hands into the warm water, her movements practiced and steady. She had kept house for years before venturing west, and the familiarity of the chore steadied her nerves. When the dishes were done, Jack cleared his throat. "You've a right to be tired. You should rest." Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you. I'll be out of your way come morning." Emily looked up sharply. "But she doesn't have to go right away, does she, Papa? She can stay a little while." Jack's eyes met Lydia's across the table, and for a moment the air between them held something unspoken. He was torn. Lydia could see it. On one hand, he was a man of caution, protective of his daughter, wary of bringing trouble under his roof. On the other, he saw the way Emily clung to Lydia, the way her laughter came easier tonight than perhaps it had in months. He rubbed the back of his neck, his voice rough when he finally answered. "One day at a time, Emily. That's all we can promise." Emily accepted the answer with a sigh, then leaned against Lydia's arm, her eyelids heavy. Lydia gently smoothed the girl's hair, a tenderness rising in her that surprised her with its strength. It had been so long since she'd felt needed, not just tolerated, not just surviving, but needed. When Jack carried Emily off to bed, Lydia lingered in the kitchen, staring at the lantern's glow flickering against the wall. She should have been uneasy in this house of strangers, yet instead she felt a strange sense of belonging beginning to stir. Jack returned, standing in the doorway, his voice quieter now. "You've been through a hard thing. I don't know your story in full, but I know enough. I can't offer you more than shelter for now, but you're welcome here so long as you earn your keep." Lydia met his gaze, steadying her voice. "That's all I ask. A chance to work and a roof for as long as I can." He studied her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll see how it goes." When he left her to rest, Lydia sat alone in the quiet room, her heart trembling. With both fear and hope. She had been abandoned once already, but perhaps, just perhaps, this might be the beginning of something new. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Lydia hadn't expected. What was meant to be one night turned into several, and then a week. Each morning she rose early, her hands eager to work. She swept floors, mended torn shirts, and cooked meals that filled the kitchen with comforting scents. She needed no prompting. Her sense of duty, and perhaps her desire to prove herself useful, guided her every step. Jack said little, though his watchful eyes followed her often. He wasn't unkind, but he remained reserved, a man guarding both his household and his heart. Yet Lydia could tell he noticed. When she baked fresh bread one evening, she saw the faintest lift at the corner of his mouth as Emily clapped her hands in delight. When she repaired a rip in his work shirt, carefully stitching until the fabric was sound again, he muttered a quiet "thank you" that carried more weight than longer words might have. Emily, on the other hand, blossomed like a wildflower in the sun. With Lydia around, her laughter filled the rooms more often, her chatter spilling endlessly as she shadowed Lydia through chores. She learned how to peel potatoes without wasting too much, how to fold laundry into neat stacks, how to hum while she worked. Sometimes, Lydia caught the girl's small hand slipping into hers, the same way she had at the station, as if claiming her without question. The ranch itself began to feel less foreign. Lydia would watch Jack ride out in the mornings, the silhouette of horse and rider cutting a strong figure against the pale dawn. She admired his diligence, though she worried at the weariness in his shoulders when he returned each evening. A man carrying the weight of both ranch and family, she thought, would have little energy left for joy. One afternoon, while Emily napped, Lydia found herself alone in the kitchen. She stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, the aroma of herbs filling the air. For the first time since she had arrived in this town, she felt something stir inside her chest that wasn't sorrow or humiliation. It was quieter, softer, belonging. The thought frightened her as much as it warmed her. She had been burned once by false promises. To let herself hope again seemed dangerous. Yet she couldn't ignore the way this little household, cobbled together by chance, seemed to fit her so naturally. That evening, after supper, Jack surprised her by speaking more than his usual handful of words. He leaned back in his chair, studying her as Emily played with a rag doll near the hearth. "You've done a great deal since you came," he said slowly. "The place feels different." Lydia blinked, unsure how to respond. "Different good, I hope?" she asked carefully. Jack's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Different good." The warmth of his words spread through her like the fire crackling in the stove. She nodded, ducking her head to hide the sudden flush on her cheeks. "Papa laughs." "More now," Emily piped up, lifting her doll proudly as though it were proof. "I heard him this morning when the chickens got loose. He hasn't laughed like that in a long time." Jack cleared his throat, clearly embarrassed, but Lydia caught the truth in Emily's words. His face still bore the weight of loss, but there were cracks forming in the walls he had built around himself. Later that night, as Lydia prepared for bed in the little spare room, she sat at the edge of the quilt and folded her hands in her lap. She thought of the station, the cruel whispers, the humiliation, the hopelessness. And she thought of now, Emily's hand in hers, Jack's quiet acknowledgement, the sense of usefulness she hadn't felt in years. She whispered a prayer of gratitude, even as doubt tugged at her. This was not her home, not truly. At any moment, Jack could decide she had stayed long enough. She told herself she must guard her heart, must remember that her place here was temporary. But as she lay down beneath the quilt, she realized the truth. Her heart was already beginning to slip its guard. She was falling, not just into the rhythm of the house, but into something deeper, something she hadn't dared to imagine. The fragile peace Lydia had begun to know did not last unbroken. Just as the air warmed with the promise of spring and the days on the ranch found their rhythm, the shadows of her past crept back into the light. It began on a Saturday morning when Emily begged her father to take them both into town. The little girl wanted new ribbon for her doll's hair, and Lydia had agreed to help select fabric for a Sunday dress. Jack, after some hesitation, agreed. He hitched the wagon, and soon the three of them rode into town, the clatter of hooves on dirt roads, marking the journey. Lydia felt both anxious and proud as they entered the bustling main street. For the first time since arriving at the station weeks ago, she did not feel like the abandoned stranger everyone whispered about. She was part of something, sitting beside Jack, with Emily between them, chatting excitedly about lace and colors. Heads turned, of course, but Lydia held her chin higher, determined to ignore the stares. But fate, it seemed, was not so easily defied. Near the mercantile, as Lydia stepped down from the wagon, her breath froze. There, leaning against the rail outside the saloon, was Thomas Hale, the man who had promised her marriage, who had written sweet letters, and who had left her stranded at the station. His eyes widened when he recognized her, then narrowed with calculation. He straightened, smoothed his coat, and sauntered toward her with the easy arrogance she now realized had always been part of him. "Well, if it isn't my dear Lydia," he drawled, loud enough for nearby townsfolk to hear. "Didn't expect to see you again after you were left waiting." Lydia's face burned as curious eyes swung toward her. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Jack, noticing the tension, stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Lydia and the approaching man. "Is this the fellow?" Jack asked in a low, steady voice. Thomas smirked, ignoring Jack's warning tone. "She didn't tell you, did she? Poor girl came here thinking I'd marry her. Guess she wasn't quite what I had in mind after all." His chuckle was cruel, slicing through Lydia like a blade. "Can't blame me for changing my mind, yaban." Humiliation of that day at the station returned in full force. Lydia felt as though the ground itself betrayed her, pulling her down into shame. Whispers stirred in the crowd that had gathered, old gossip rekindled with fresh fuel. Jack's jaw tightened. His hand curled into a fist at his side, but he did not strike. Instead, he leveled Thomas with a gaze so cold it silenced the laughter around them. "You've said enough," he said flatly. But Thomas wasn't finished. "Be careful, friend. Women like her bring nothing but trouble. You think she just happened upon your ranch by chance?" He let out a snort. "Mark my words, she's—" Looking for a man to save her. Lydia could not bear it. She turned, fleeing into the mercantile, her eyes stinging with tears. Inside, she pressed her palms against a shelf, struggling to steady her breath. She had worked so hard to build a sliver of belonging, and with a few careless words, it all seemed to crumble again. Jack found her minutes later. He didn't speak immediately, simply set a gentle hand on her shoulder. She braced herself for rejection. For him to say Thomas was right, that she had brought shame into his home. Instead, his voice was quiet, but steady. "What he said doesn't change what I've seen here. You've been nothing but good to Emily, and to this place. Don't let his lies undo that." Lydia looked up at him, searching his face. His eyes were storm-dark, filled with anger not at her, but at the man who had wronged her. It gave her a fragile thread of hope. Yet doubt lingered, burrowing deep. The town had heard Thomas's words, and gossip had a way of festering. That evening, back at the ranch, Lydia busied herself with chores, but her hands trembled. She knew Jack was torn, between protecting his daughter's household from scandal and the trust he had begun to place in her. She feared she would not be enough to tip the balance. Alone in her small room that night, Lydia pressed her face into her pillow, whispering to the silence, "I cannot lose this. Not again." But outside, the winds carried the truth. The shadows of her past had returned, and the test of her fragile place in Jack's world had only just begun. The days after the encounter in town weighed heavy on the ranch. Lydia felt the shift in the air, an unease that stretched like a taut rope between her and Jack. He had defended her against Thomas's cruel words, yes, but the whispers from the townsfolk had followed them home. Every chore, every shared meal, every stolen moment of warmth with Emily was shadowed by Lydia's fear that she was no longer welcome. Jack grew quieter, his thoughts buried deep. He was a man who measured carefully before speaking, and that silence gnawed at Lydia more than any accusation could. When he looked at her across the supper table, she could not tell if it was with trust or with doubt. Emily, innocent of the storm around them, chattered happily as always. She tugged at Lydia's skirts while helping with dough, begged for stories by the fire, and clung to her hand on the walk to the barn. To Emily, Lydia was already part of their family. It was the child's laughter that Lydia found fleeting courage, though in the still hours of night. She lay awake, wondering how long she could stay before Jack asked her to leave. On the third evening after the confrontation, Jack came in from the fields later than usual. His face was drawn, his hands still streaked with dust. He lingered by the doorway, watching Lydia as she folded laundry near the hearth. She braced herself, sensing what was to come. "Lydia," he began, his voice low. "We need to talk." The words chilled her. She set aside the cloth, smoothing it with trembling fingers. Of course. Jack shifted, as though the weight of his decision pressed down on his shoulders. What that man said in town. It stirred up talk. Folks don't forget things easily. I need to think of Emily, of the ranch. I can't bring scandal to her life. Her throat tightened. "I understand," she whispered. It was the answer she had dreaded yet expected. "You've given me more kindness than I deserved already. I'll leave in the morning." Jack's eyes flickered, troubled. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Emily burst in before he could answer, clutching her rag doll. "Papa!" she cried, running to him. "Don't send Miss Lydia away, please don't!" Her small arms wrapped fiercely around Lydia's waist, as if she could anchor her in place by sheer will. "She makes our home warm again. You laugh more. The house doesn't feel empty anymore. Don't make her go." The child's words pierced through the silence. Jack's jaw worked as he tried to hold firm, but his gaze fell on Lydia. On the quiet tears that glistened in her eyes, on the way Emily clung to her as though to life itself. For weeks he had watched Lydia breathe gentleness back into his daughter's days. She had brought light into corners of his home long darkened by grief. Could he truly send her away because of another man's lies? Jack crouched down, placing a steady hand on Emily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, it's not that simple," he said softly. "Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices." Emily's lip trembled, but she stood her ground. "Then make the right one, Papa, please." The room stilled, the fire crackled, throwing shadows against the walls. Jack rose slowly, his gaze never leaving Lydia's. In that silence his decision formed, not from duty or fear of gossip, but from the truth that had grown too strong to deny. "Lydia," he said finally, his voice steady now. "I don't care what that man says or what the town whispers. I've seen who you are, with my own eyes, in my own home. You've given Emily laughter again, and you've given me hope I thought I'd buried with her mother." Her breath caught, tears spilling freely now. "Jack." He stepped closer, the hesitation gone. "If you'll stay, I want you here. Not as a guest, not as a burden, but as part of this family." For a moment, Lydia could not speak. The weight of despair lifted so suddenly it left her dizzy. She looked down at Emily, whose wide smile shone with relief, then back at Jack, whose eyes, though still cautious, now held something warmer. Something like faith. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you'll have me, I'll stay." Jack nodded once, firmly, as though sealing the vow. Emily squealed and hugged them both, her joy filling the room brighter than any lamp. The choice had been made. Against gossip, against fear, against the lingering scars of the past, Jack had chosen trust. And with that trust, Lydia's fragile. Hope began to blossom into something stronger. That night, as she lay awake, Lydia no longer feared the dawn. Tomorrow would not be the end of her journey, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where she was no longer alone, no longer abandoned, but finally chosen. The next morning dawned crisp and golden, the kind of morning that seemed to whisper of change. Yet Lydia's heart was heavy with conflict. Despite Jack's words the night before, the weight of gossip still pressed on her. She couldn't bear the thought of being the reason Emily faced cruel whispers at school, or Jack lost the respect of his neighbors. So while the house still slept, she packed her small trunk and set it by the door. She lingered in the kitchen, letting her hand rest on the table where she had shared so many meals with them, listening to the creak of the old ranch settling into the day. It felt like leaving a piece of herself behind. When Jack came in from the barn, wiping sweat and dust, from his brow, his eyes fell immediately on the trunk. His face hardened. "You mean to leave?" Her throat tightened. "I thought it best, for Emily, for you. I can't bear to be the shadow over your lives." Jack stepped closer, his jaw set. "You think running will spare us? Lydia, this house was a hollow shell before you came. Emily needed a mother's kindness, and I—" He paused, struggling to steady his voice. "I needed someone to remind me that life isn't only about loss. You've given us both more than I can ever repay." Before Lydia could answer, Emily stumbled sleepily into the room, her doll dangling from her hand. She saw the trunk and froze. "No," she whispered, then louder, panicked. "No! You can't leave! You promised, Miss Lydia." The child's tears undid her. Lydia fell to her knees, wrapping Emily in her arms. "Oh, sweet girl," she choked. "I never meant to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you." Emily's small hands clutched her face. "But Papa said you're family now, and I need you. Don't you need us too?" The question pierced Lydia's soul. Did she need them? Yes, more than she'd ever needed anything. The loneliness she had carried for years had been soothed. Here, in the laughter of a child, and the steady strength of a man who looked at her with quiet faith. Jack knelt beside them, his large hand resting gently on Lydia's shoulder. "You belong here, Lydia. Not because Emily wants it, not because I need help, but because you've become part of us. Don't let fear drive you away." Tears blurred her vision, but through them she saw the truth in his eyes. Slowly she nodded. "Then I'll stay. If you'll still have me, I'll stay." The relief on Emily's face was radiant, her sobs breaking into giggles as she hugged them both. Jack's hand tightened on Lydia's shoulder, a quiet promise more binding than any words. But fate had one final turn to offer. Later that afternoon, Lydia found herself at the train station once again, not to leave but to face the ghosts of her past. The abandoned trunk still sat there, a silent reminder of the day she had been left broken. People recognized her, some whispering behind gloved hands. Jack stood at her side, tall and unflinching, Emily clinging to his hand. The whispers faltered when they saw the rancher's firm stance. Jack didn't speak loudly, but his presence alone was enough to silence doubt. As the train whistled into the station, Lydia realized this was where her story had turned. She had been abandoned on this platform, unwanted and humiliated. But now, standing between Jack and Emily, she no longer felt small. She felt chosen. Emily tugged at her hand, her little face glowing with pride. She repeated the words she had first spoken weeks ago, words that had changed everything. "Come home to Papa." This time, Lydia laughed through her tears and bent down to kiss the girl's hair. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. Home is where you are. Jack reached for her hand, rough and calloused but steady. She slipped her fingers into his without hesitation. The gesture was simple, but in it lay all the promises of a future. Partnership, family, love. As the train pulled away, Lydia didn't watch it go with regret. She had no need to run, no need to seek another chance elsewhere. Her place was here, beside the man and child who had seen her not as a burden or scandal, but as someone worthy of love. The station faded behind them as they walked toward the wagon. Emily skipped ahead, humming, her doll bouncing at her side. Jack fell into step beside Lydia, his arm brushing hers. For the first time in years, Lydia felt whole. Her journey had not ended in abandonment, but in belonging. The heartbreak that had once defined her was replaced with the steady warmth of hope. And as the wagon rolled back toward the ranch, she knew that this was not merely a new beginning. It was, at last, the life she had been meant to find, the life she would never let go of again.